So today I'm here to talk about the new releases I've been recently reading when it comes to horror and thrillers. This video will not include Womb City because I did a separate review. It was so fantastic, it deserved its own video, so definitely go check that out if you missed that last week. But these are other new releases that I think are worth your time, some that are not, and ones that you've probably at least heard about and are trying to decide whether or not you should check them out. So if that all sounds good, let's get started. First, let's talk about Small Town Horror by Ronald Malfi, a book that I received for review from the publisher. And this is an author that I've read many of their backlist books. I've come to love them as a great storyteller and will read anything that they publish. And so this is a new novel that follows a man who has left his small town life behind. He's moved to New York City, he has a wife who is pregnant, and has just moved on. However, one late night phone call brings him all back to the past, everything he left behind. He reunites with his childhood friends. He has to lie to his wife about everything that he's doing. And the story slowly reveals itself. You get to find out what happened before, what is happening now. And this is a book that I just enjoyed because of the fact that, as I said, Ronald Malfi is just a really good storyteller. He does write into some of the classic tropes of the horror genre, specifically the kind of coming of age stories that surround it. So if you love things in the vein of It and Summer of Nights, and really those stories that focus on like revisiting one's past and kind of reflecting on what happened long ago. And as the title suggests, very much that small town life focus, and which has its own kind of nuances and culture around it. That is what this book is. And I'll be honest, it doesn't necessarily do anything I've never seen before. It's not completely out of the box or innovative, but it's really well done. And even though it doesn't necessarily bring anything new to the table, I can very much appreciate when I just feel like a story is doing what it's trying to do very well. It knows its place, it knows its audience, and I was very much captivated in the story. I thought the main character was very likable and interesting, and kind of his group of friends and everything, you're kind of puzzling it out along the way. It felt very nostalgic for this past of this character, and I just got wrapped into it. It was a book I read very quickly, easy to fly through, and if you're a fan of Ronald Malfi, you definitely want to pick this up. If you haven't read this author before, I think this is a perfectly fine place to start. Next, we have The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry. This is another new release sent to me by the publisher. This one follows a woman who gets a job cleaning the house of this famous horror director, and they are obsessed with the films. They get this opportunity. Of course, there's an agreement to have the privacy, and as they are working there, slowly more is revealed about what's happening. Now, this is a great book to talk about right after Ronald Malfi because I actually compare Christina Henry to Malfi all the time, that they're both storytellers that are great at doing their craft. They're not necessarily writing things I've never read before, but they do what they do very well. And what I like about both of them is they tend to write stories that are all a little bit different. Sometimes authors get stuck in really small boxes and they write the same subgenre over and over again. But Christina Henry has done retellings of fairy tales and different things, dystopians and coming of age stories. And each book just feels like a different approach, a different focus on perhaps tropes and storytelling narratives I've read before, but are interesting to revisit. This one I thought was good. It isn't my favorite of her work. I like the general setup, of course. I think anyone who's a fan of horror books is probably also a fan of horror movies and just can understand or relate to this character who loves this director, loves their work, and finds a lot of comfort in these films. And so I thought that this was a great setup. It actually reminded me a lot of Night Film in terms of the premise, if you read that by Marisha Pessl. And so this one, not the same story, but kind of leans into the same idea. You have this mysterious director and you kind of find out what is all behind what is happening. At first, I would say it did lack a little bit of suspense. It took a while to get going and you kind of spend time with the characters, which felt more cozy in the house than, oh no, what is happening in the background. But slowly it does kind of build into that. And I've had a complaint with this book. It's the fact that I didn't really love the ending. It's one where I got to the end and had to do that what did I just read and kind of reread through the ending. It just felt incomplete or rushed or just not very impactful. I always say that I'm someone who enjoys the journey rather than just the destination, but I was kind of underwhelmed by the destination, if I'm honest. So especially if you're someone who is looking for a big punchy ending, I found this one to be kind of lackluster. And again, not my favorite of her work. If you're a big fan of Christina Henry, I would definitely recommend reading this one, but I don't think it is the best representation of what she can do. Great premise overall, but didn't quite live up to the potential when it comes to the execution. Next up is Bad Men by Julie Mae Cohen, and this is a thriller that follows a woman woman who decides to be a vigilante for justice, fighting for women who are preyed upon by bad men. So essentially within the story, she is willing to kill off these men. She does not see herself as a serial killer, but again, doing something good for the sake of justice. And so this all started back in her youth when there was another girl that was being preyed on by an older man in school. And so she decided to go and protect this woman. And so she does horrible things to horrible men and justifies it in her mind because of the fact that they are so bad to begin with. So this is one of these books I love because of the fact that it deals with morally gray characters that we as a reader can very easily like and understand and empathize with our main character. She is meant to be likable. This isn't a case of following a serial killer like Jo from the book You by Carolyn Kepnes. Instead, this one, you will actually like her, and her reasoning feels very sound within the book. I recognize I'm not endorsing any of this vigilante-ness. I definitely encourage everyone to go through proper criminal and justice channels if you ever need to do so. But essentially with this book, I think it's really compelling because of the fact that it feels like a response to the Me Too movement, the fact that you have all these women standing up saying Me Too, bringing their voice forward. And in many cases, there is no justice, there isn't the evidence, or different, statutes of limitations have fallen through. And I feel like this is a really cutting perspective and response to some of that. I don't think by any means the author is really endorsing what's in the book. And again, I think that's the fun of fiction, is being able to play around with ideas that we would never dream about playing around with in our real lives. And so I just enjoyed this one. I thought it was just a really clever twist on the serial killer because again, they're not the typical serial killer that you followed. They never felt like the villain. Instead, the men very much kind of deserved what they got. So I had fun with this book. It was maybe a touch too long. I think it could have been a shorter book just because it is a simple premise. It wasn't overly complex in terms of the plotting, but I had a good time with it. I thought the character was interesting, and I definitely read more by this author. And yeah, overall, I thought it was pretty fun. Next, let's talk about Night's Edge by Liz Kerin. This is the first book in a series. I believe it came out last year, and unfortunately, I somehow missed it, and I'm now reading it now. So this follows a young woman as she is struggling with the fact that she is a vampire. It's known right away. It's not a spoiler. She, of course, has a hunger for blood and is trying to just get out of the situation she's in. At the beginning of the story, she meets someone and they work together. This is one that is really hard to give a synopsis for because I'll be honest, not a lot happens in this book, which could be a criticism or a negative for a lot of readers. And so you really have to know yourself if you're going to pick up this book. But despite what I just said, I actually loved it. So for me, this is much more a character study of a young woman who is dealing with a poor economic class and situation. Just because of the fact that she is a vampire, she's not able to really get out of the situation she has fallen into. You find out that her mother was a victim and all of this. So there's like layers and generational trauma and everything that builds into a story that really makes it hard for someone to move up in life. And so we follow her and her struggles. But again, there is plotting to this story, but it's really not the reason to read it. Instead, you get to follow these struggles. I immediately related to the main character. I found her likable, but again, kind of morally complex. You have always that complexity that comes with the vampire life. And it didn't feel overly tropey. It was part of the story, but I felt like they didn't lean too far into the parts that kind of can get goofy when it comes to vampires. Instead, it just felt like following this character and just sympathizing with them and following them along the way. It's a story that just enamored me. I thought the prose was beautiful. I don't always appreciate good writing, but the writing here was so good. It just made me stop and want to highlight things and copy down quotes and just reread passages, which doesn't always happen. I tend to inhale my books, which is definitely what I wanted to do with this one. So I wanted to spend time with it and then also read it as quickly as possible because I was enjoying it so much. I think if you enjoy the prose and writing style of someone like Bret Easton Ellis, you will enjoy this. Less so American Psycho, more so as other books like Less Than Zero, where again, you're just kind of having that slice of life, dealing with terrible characters and terrible situations, doing somewhat terrible things, and you're just sitting there with the characters, kind of more spending time with them. If you enjoy things like that and don't need a lot of momentum and narrative drive in your books, hopefully you will love this one as much as I did. Then from there, I went on to read First Light, which is the sequel. This is the new release that just came out. I do recommend if you're going to read this, you do want to go back to the beginning. First, because the initial book is fantastic, and also because it is a direct sequel. I like this one, but not as much as the first. I think it's just the fact that that when I really like a book like that, I tend to be very satisfied with it if it had been a standalone, and I'm not someone who necessarily wants to spend more time in the world as opposed to just having a really good, tight experience. But at the same time, I enjoyed my time with this book. I just would have been satisfied either way, given the nature of the writing style. But again, the writing was beautiful. It was great. Like, it didn't go down in quality in any way. I just think these kind of books can work very well as a standalone in terms of impact. And reading a second book dealing with the same things just felt a little bit more familiar, and of course then a little bit less fresh. But overall, if you enjoy the series, I do recommend continuing on. And if there is another book, I will happily read it. I will not complain, because I just love what this author is doing and definitely want to check out more by them. Next, let's talk about The Hunter's Daughter, another book I received from publisher for review. And this one follows a young woman who finds out as a child that her father was a serial killer. He goes to jail, and she ended up actually coming across the crime and being exposed to the horrors of what happened. And so we follow her now as an adult, where the story picks up, and she is of course dealing with the trauma of the past, and that is really reopened up at the beginning because there appears to be a copycat serial killer on the loose. And so the police reach out to her. Her father is still in jail, so he doesn't seem to be the one causing all this, but they're trying to figure out if there's a connection, is he communicating, all of that sort of thing. And this is one I picked up very excited. I love serial killer stories, and this is kind of a premise. It's almost this small subgenre of stories involving specifically usually the daughter of a serial killer, and you get to kind of follow them and their trauma as the story progresses. And so it's a story that I've read very similar books before, and so I couldn't help but compare it to those that I found to be more interesting, more compelling. There also was the argument that the ones I read before, obviously I read first, and so they were more fresh in terms of the narrative tropes. This one was fine. It was just very character focused, so it really, again, dealt more with her trauma and just her as a person. If you're someone who is just looking for those like grisly details and want to focus on the sensationalism that comes around serial killers, this book eventually does get there to a degree. They do parse through what happened and so forth, but it's much more about this daughter dealing with her mixed feelings towards her father, a father that she loved, a father that she had great memories with, and then trying to deal with the fact that all of this happened. And so if you're someone who likes character-driven stories more than thrillers, I think this one will appeal to you a little bit more than it worked for me. It just didn't focus on the details that I wanted it to, and I probably sound very callous when I say that. I think it picked up towards the end, but it had a really slow start, and if I wasn't reading it as a review copy, I probably could have put it down because the first half of it was pretty slow going for me and didn't really pull me in. Then we have Disturbing the Dead by Kelley Armstrong, and this is the third book in a historical thriller series that I am obsessed with. So we follow a woman who is living at first in the modern day of Canada, and something happens and she ends up being sent back in time to historical Scotland, and she ends up inside the body of this maid, and that is the setup to the first book. Through circumstance, she ends up helping and becoming the assistant of someone who is a somewhat detective and helps them to solve crimes, and so she has her expertise of the modern age, but is forced to work within the conventions of what was known and available at that point in time. So it's a mystery story, but also again has that like time travel flair to it that very much feels reminiscent of Outlander. It has a little bit of romance, just some funny dialogue, some humor, kind of the jokes around them saying things that don't make sense for the day and age. And I believe, as far as I know, from what I've read, this author's done a decent amount of work and research in the story, which definitely feels true. So I think they do their best to avoid anachronisms and really ideally give the reader a little bit of insight into that time period as you're reading, so hopefully you feel like you're learning a little bit. I'm not someone who reads a lot of historical fiction, but this was so enjoyable, and I just binged through these books every time I get my hands on one. So this is the third and newest book in the series, and I hope that there is more because I feel like it's just getting started. There were some great reveals related to what was happening and why she was back in time, which I thought were fantastic. And then there is this murder case that involves an Egyptian mummy, and there's just so much great things happening. And again, there was so much more to be explored. Again, it feels like falling into the Outlander series where you can just binge book after book. Unfortunately, I'm now caught up to the newest release, so I have to wait probably at least a year for another book. But if you haven't read this series, if you're looking for something bingeable with narrative drive that's easy to fly through, with good characters, and you're someone who likes a series of books specifically, so I just talked about enjoying a standalone, but this is one where you will read book 1 like I did and want to immediately read book 2 and then impatiently have to wait for this 3rd book. And so I encourage you, this series has 3 books out, so go ahead, start binging through it, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I do. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please, if you enjoyed this, let me and YouTube know with a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if just a little emoji lets me know you're here. And you can hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video. If you enjoyed this, definitely hope you stick around, and please go ahead and check out my Womb City video because that book needs more love on the internet. So if you enjoyed this, I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.